And I do know and believe the Lord in mercy pardoned me. And now I've come to ask you to forgive me. And I'll never grieve you any more, my dear pastor. It need not be said that the penitent was freely forgiven and owned a brother in the Lord. And the Lord was praised for the wonderful way in which it had all come about. The genuineness of the backslider's restoration is evident from the testimony of Mr. Huchin, the minister at Stambourne, who succeeded Mr. Spurgeon's grandfather, and who has also ascertained from official records the correct way of spelling old roads. The name, Mr. Huchin writes, Thomas Rhodes was one of the old men of the table pew, an active, lively little man, but quite illiterate, not much above a labourer. But he kept a pony and cart, and did a little buying and selling on his own account. I found him an earnest and zealous Christian, striving to be useful in every way possible to him, especially in the prayer meetings and among the young people, opening his house for Christian conversation and prayer. He only lived about 4 years of my time, and was sustained with a cheerful confidence to the end. When near death, on my taking up the Bible to read and pray with him, he said, I have counted the leaves, sir. I said, Why? What did you do that for? And he replied, I never could read a word of it, and thought I would know how many leaves there were. This was very pathetic and revealed much. We had a good hope of him, and missed him greatly. Chapter 4. Stambourne Meeting House. It was a rare old chapel. I wish it could have remained forever, as I used to know it. Let me see if I can sketch it with my pen. When I was a boy of 12, I made this drawing of the back of the old meeting house. I have been welcomed at a farmer's table on the promise of making a picture of his house. I am rather glad that this pencil memorial was preserved by my dear Aunt Anne, but I must now, 45 years later, use the pen on the same subject. The pulpit was glorious as the tower of the flock. Over it hung a huge sounding board. I used to speculate as to what would become of grandfather if it ever dropped down upon him. I thought of my jack-in-the-box, and hoped that my dear grandpa would never be shut down and shut up in such a fashion. At the back of the pulpit was a peg to hold the minister's hat. Inside there was room for two, for I have sat there with grandfather when quite a little boy. But I guess that 2 grown-up people would have found it quite too small enough, as my Dutch friend puts it. Just below and in front of the pulpit was the table pew, wherein sat the elders of the congregation, the men of gracious light and leading. There Uncle Haddon generally stood, and gave out the hymns and the notices, and from that semi-sacred region was raised the block of wood, by which, to the singers upstairs, the metre of the hymn was made known, common, long, or short. There were big tombstones forming the bottom of this large pew, which took its name from containing the table on which were spread the bread and wine on days when they had the ordinance. I think that was the correct phrase when our good folks intended the communion. I don't remember hearing them style infant baptism the ordinance, but I suppose they thought it to be one. A few had qualms upon the question, and were baptized quietly at some Baptist chapel. The pews in the middle were mostly square in form and roomy. Those on either side were aristocratic and lined with green baize, for the most part very faded. In some cases, brass rods carried up little curtains, which made the family pew quite private, and shut out all sights but that of the grave and reserved senior who dispensed to us the word of life. There were flaps inside the pew, so as not to lose the space where the door opened, and flaps for the poor to sit upon in the aisle outside of these pews. And when the time came to go home, there was such a lifting up and letting down of flaps and flap seats within the pew and without the pew as one never does see in these degenerate days. A little boy on a hassock on the floor of one of these holy loose boxes ought to have been good, and no doubt was as good there as anywhere, especially if he had a peppermint to suck and nobody to play with. I cannot forget the big clock, which had a face outside the chapel as well as one inside. When his long body had been newly grained, he seemed a very suitable piece of furniture for a nice, clean, old-fashioned Puritan meeting house. If I am rightly informed, the veteran timekeeper was bought by the miller, and is now upon one of his sheds. To what strange uses we may come at last. The people were mainly real Essex. They talked of places down in the shires, as if they were quite foreign parts, and young fellows who went down into the hundreds were explorers of a respectable order of hardihood. They loved a good sermon, and would say, "Mr. Spurgeon, I heard you well this morning." I thought the good man had preached well, but their idea was not so much to his credit. They judged that they had heard him well, and there's something in the different way of putting it. At any rate, it takes from the preacher all ground of glorying in what he has done. They were a people who could and would hear the gospel, but I don't think they would have put up with anything else. They were as apt at criticism as here and there one. Some of them were very wise in their remarks, and some were otherwise. Well do I remember an occasion upon which the preacher had treated the tares after the manner of the East, and was altogether right in so doing. But they said he wouldn't know a tare if he saw one. It was painful to hear a man talk so ignorant. To say that you couldn't tell wheat from tares when they were a-growing was ridiculous. The rustic critics were wrong for once. But on matters of doctrine or experience, you would have found them quite a match for you.